Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Trek Wars at OSU. That's Oregon State University. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State. And I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that imagine a future free of domination, exploitation, oppression, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we maintain is this, Trek Wars at OSU, in which we examine major science fiction and fantasy franchises such as Star Trek and Star Wars to help us make sense of developments in our current social, political, and cultural life. Today, an episode on whether immortal life is boring. The quest for immortality has long been a trope of science fiction stories, and it's arguably one of the oldest tales in human history, going back, in fact, to Gilgamesh's search for immortality after the death of his beloved companion. Now, immortal life is usually presented as something that's exciting at first, but appearances can always be deceiving with this story. And this is the way in which immortality is dealt with in the new Star Trek Picard. So there's going to be a variety of different spoilers here if you haven't seen the new season of Star Trek Picard, so just be forewarned. But it is revealed at the end of season 1 that Data was not annihilated at the end of the movie Star Trek Nemesis, in which he committed suicide to try to save the Enterprise and Captain Picard. But in fact, Data's memories were preserved and were uploaded to a quantum simulation by Bruce Maddox. So when Picard dies at the end of the season, his brain engrams are recorded by Dr. Girardi and by Dr. Soong III, and he has a chance to reunite with Data in virtual reality. Now, the scene in which Data and Picard are reunited, in fact, is perhaps one of the best of the series, I think. And in an interview with Michael Chabon, Patrick Stewart admitted that it was one of the most difficult scenes for he and Brent Spiner to film because it was so emotional for the both of them. In the scene, Picard finds out that his biological body has perished and his consciousness is going to be uploaded into a synth body, an artificial body. Data asks that Picard do him a favor, and that before he leaves to be downloaded into the synth body, that Picard erase his, that is Data's, consciousness from the simulation so that he can finally experience something that most humans will experience, or that all humans will experience, right? This is the most human of all experiences, death. Now, this is a storyline that Star Trek and science fiction has dealt with many times. And I was interested in how Star Trek Picard explained Data's reasonings for his choice to end his own life. Data's eternal quest has always been to become more human, and in this way he takes over the famous Pinocchio role in Gene Roddenberry's storytelling that was first filled with someone like Spock, right? The alien or the other who wants to become human, and in his quest to become human teaches us more about what it means to be human in the first place. So in Star Trek Picard, Data argues that all human life ends. So his immortal existence in the simulation is preventing him in some way from being able to undergo something that all human beings must experience, death. And so he himself wants to experience this. He tells Picard in a really important line, a butterfly that lives forever is not a butterfly at all. Right? An immortal life is not a human one, since human beings die. And so in order to complete his quest of achieving humanity, he too must die. But Data here is suggesting that death is not only something that all humans have to be experiencing. He goes further than this in the episode. He suggests that death is something that defines us. He tells Picard that all the good things of human life, things like peace, love, friendship, are precious precisely because they are of limited duration. Dying is the bookend that gives human life its structural meaning as a good. So the suggestion here is that Data has done everything that a human being could possibly want to experience, except death. And so now he must end it so that all his experiences can have their place in the story of his life. I'm curious about this perspective because I'm not sure that it's right. Data seems to be saying that immortal life is not a human one, not only because all human beings must eventually die, but that death itself is needed to give human life meaning, and that no other kind of experience can do this. An immortal life is just one full of experiences that go on, leading to a kind of tedium or dullness and repetition. And this has to be ended in order to give that life meaning. So this claim that an immortal life is boring is something that you find in a lot of science fiction, and it's something that philosophers have talked about quite a bit. In fact, it reminds me of this claim that immortal life is boring and that death is needed to give life its kind of structure and framework. This is an argument that we find being made by the philosopher Bernard Williams in a very famous article called The Macropolis Affair. Now, William's starting point is the story of Alina Macropolis, the character from Jean Essex's opera, The Macropolis Case. In the opera, Alina Macropolis is a woman who is 342 years old. Her father is a mad scientist of sort, and he gave her a life extension potion at the age of 42. So now, some 300 years later, she's really bored. She's lived a full life with many, many different kinds of experiences and been many, many different kinds of people. But her life is repetitive and tedious. And by the end of the opera, she decides not to take the elixir anymore so that she can die. Now, Williams thinks that Macropolis made the right decision. And he tries to explain why an immortal life would be so boring as to make life really unbearable. In his argument, he says that he thinks a desirable life is one in which we would have the capacity to satisfy particular goals and aims. And he categorizes the different aims in this way. There are categorical kinds of desires, and these are the kinds of things that we organize our life around. We have aims, for instance, to raise a child, to write a novel, to build a career. These are goals and aims that structure and give foundation to our lives, and we build lives around them. We also have contingent desires, and these are our momentary fleeting desires, like itches to be scratched. They're desires to eat, to drink, to feel satisfied in warmth, and in sexual desire, perhaps. They're momentary, and once they're satisfied, we sort of forget them, and they're repetitive, right? We're hungry one day, we'll be hungry the next, and one experience of hunger is really no different than another. But categorical desires are very, very specific. They give our life meaning to have. And so what Bernard Williams thinks is that an immortal life is tedious because after a long while, you will run out of categorical desires to structure your life, and everything will become like a contingent desire. Your life will be bland and structureless without any framework to give it that kind of bookend. So this seems very similar to Data's complaint that without death, life is just not complete. It's repetitive, boring, without structure. I think you can find this kind of treatment of immortal life echoed in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. One of the most prominent depictions, I think, is the 1986 film Highlander. Here we have a hero, MacLeod, and in the film, he's shown as worn out. He's a tired warrior, seeking as part of his quest to become the one in the universe. The one is the immortal who gets to slay all the other immortals on the planet, and by doing so wins a big prize. And the big prize turns out to be having a mortal life. Longevity here is depicted as a curse that all of the immortals want to achieve, the ability to be able to end this all, because longevity is a curse. MacLeod experiences his immortal life as one in which he can't have meaningful relationships with people because he outlives all his loved ones. And most importantly, it seems he cannot have any children. So the happy ending at the end when MacLeod becomes the one is that he wins a normal life in which he gets to age with a partner, and most importantly, he gets to have children with this partner. So it's in some sense, a very kind of heteronormative story. But here the idea is that a mortal life is one that, because it ends, gives people the ability to have some kind of sense of meaning. And then an immortal life is just going to become one that's repetitive and boring and tedious, and one that you will seek as best as you can to try to end. I think there are several reasons to believe that this take on immortality is wrong. And I think the thing to say to people who say that immortality would be boring is the same thing that I tell my kids when they complain about being bored. Life isn't boring. There are just boring people. So the way that I want to sort of get at this kind of point is to consider a couple of arguments by some philosophers who've tried to take on Bernard Williams. The first one is John Martin Fisher, in an argument in which he tries to show that Williams has gotten something really wrong about this idea of desires, aims, and goals in human life. Now, I got to sort of be upfront and say that John Martin Fisher was one of my professors in graduate school, and I actually took a seminar in my first year of graduate school precisely on this question about the tedium of immortality. So I took an entire class on this subject. But he convinced me something in this class about this idea of different kinds of pleasures. And so Fisher says that Williams ignores a distinction between different kinds of desires in human life. There are what Fisher calls self-exhausting pleasures. These are things that once you've done them, you're done with them and probably don't ever want to do them again. Examples might be something like climbing Mount Everest or graduating from high school. These are things that you've done them, you're done with them. However, life also has a lot of repeatable pleasures. There are things that you enjoy doing time and time again, and each time is different, and each time is enjoyable in its own right. So for instance, repeatable pleasures include things like eating at your favorite restaurant time and time again, listening to your favorite song, or reading your favorite book. These things you enjoy each time you do them. And even though you know the story or you know the melody or the lyrics to your favorite song, you don't ever say, oh, I've already listened to that song, I don't want to ever hear it again, but you look forward to the experience of doing it. And sometimes you might see things in a different kind of way when you read your favorite book. So the idea is here that Williams has made some kind of mistake in thinking that we'll become bored by having nothing but exhausting pleasures. In fact, a rich life could be one in which you have a sort of kind of measure of repeatable pleasures. It's not clear that all desires are self-exhausting, and that an immortal life could not be satisfying through a course of repeatable pleasures. I would also add that some self-exhausting pleasures might become repeatable given different circumstances. So think about climbing Mount Everest in 1940 versus 2020 versus what might be possible in climbing technology and capabilities in 2379. Or think about climbing Mount Everest with groups of different people and different friends. It would be different experiences altogether. It would not be the same thing. And so in some sense, right, Fisher wants to say that Williams is wrong to think that we are limited in the kinds of desires and aims that we can have and that everything would become repetitive. There are many ways in which we repeat experiences and we find joy in doing so. Another argument that I find interesting that helps us to think about why Williams might be wrong about this is one that's offered by the philosopher Donald Bruckner. And Donald Bruckner analyzes three different kinds of features of human life that make experiences repeatable in ways that are not boring. First, Bruckner mentions something like memory decay. We often forget in our lives that we did something before, or we forget how it went the first time. So because our memory is often very fuzzy, and in fact, it might get fuzzier the longer that we live, we may do something again, forget that we've done it before, and decide this was fun to do, this was excitable, this was worthwhile to do even again, because we didn't quite remember how it went the first time. Brooker also points out that a feature of human life is desire rejuvenation. We often want to do things again that we've done before, right? This is, in some sense, the same kind of thing that Fisher is talking about with repeatable pleasures. We often decide that there's something that we want to do again, and we may enjoy it because it's comforting and familiar to us, or we may find new dimensions in that repeatable pleasure that we didn't notice before, and it makes it something that is once again desirable. But I think one of the things that I enjoy most about Bruckner's argument is the idea that something like Williams' argument ignores human ingenuity and imagination. We have the capacity as human beings to imagine living in all sorts of ways, with all different sorts of people. A boring life, I would say, says more about the imaginative range of the person experiencing the boredom than it does about the experiential capacity of human life in general. Right. And this is what I mean by saying that something that we might think of as a self-exhausting pleasure, like climbing Mount Everest, right? Given different time periods, given different groups of people, might be something very, very different, have a different kind of quality to it that we could find enjoyable. And the quality of its enjoyment, right? What makes it enjoyable is really depending on how we perceive it, how we interpret it, how we imagine that experience, and not so much about the fact that we're repeating something that we've done once again. So both Fisher and Bruckner suggest that Williams' suggestion about the tedium and the boringness of immortal life is off the mark, because human beings are have much more capacity to make life enjoyable if they so want to, and with their imagination. And so if we want to make immortal life more desirable, I suppose we should think about how to cultivate imagination, something that we at the Anarres Project are very interested in doing, of course. Now, I think it's possible to talk about the undesirability of immortal life. I think it is possible to represent this as something that's not something that we would want to do. But I think that perhaps the undesirability of the immortal life isn't about its tedium or its being boring, but maybe for the reason that an immortal life could be extremely lonely. I think the place to turn for this kind of thinking about immortal life comes from vampire films and the way that they represent longevity. You often see vampire films depict characters as living all sorts of lives over the course of time, displaying some amazing ingenuity about how to experience a wide variety of things. So oftentimes in vampire films, the vampires are represented as having lived many different kinds of lives with different kinds of personas. And so vampires usually have to display some amazing creativity in terms of crafting their personas. What's interesting about the portrayal of vampires is that they are often portrayed as being part of a family type unit of fellow immortals, some kind of community or a coven of vampires. Rarely are they depicted alone. And even the arch vampire Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel has his brides around him. The curse of the immortal life for vampires is not necessarily its boredom, but I think it's loneliness. So why might that be? I think most immortal lives are depicted with characters who are adults. Rarely are immortals portrayed as children or as elders, but usually as adults between what we would say in a normal human life, the ages of 18 to 50. This is a time period in which most human beings are most self-sufficient. They're able to take care of themselves and defend for themselves. They don't need people to care for them as much as, say, human beings who are children or those who are older. They have the capacity to be less interdependent with others. And in this way, they are seen somewhat as powerful, as independent, almost as gods. But here I usually think about what Aristotle thinks about what he calls, or what the ancient Greeks used to call, idion, idiots, people who are completely self-sufficient. Aristotle says that such people are either animals or they are gods, but neither are human beings. Because human beings are creatures that require care and are interdependent with one another. Human beings are born into and require community with one another in order to flourish. We need each other deeply. Vampires usually don't need anyone to care for them in the way that we do. They don't age. They're always usually represented as young adults. So they don't need community in the way that we do. But as former humans, they seek company to add to their lives. However, they can only really have that kind of community with other immortals, because having community with human beings is usually dangerous, or it's more likely unsatisfying, boring. Human beings tend to be more like pets or food than equals that they can have life with. Vampire life seems tedious because it is lonely and boring. And this is why I think that the character of Claudia from Interview from a Vampire is a really interesting representation of the vampire and of the immortal life. She was turned into a vampire while she was a child. And so she must experience the immortal vampire life in a child's body. And even though she ages for decades, hundreds of years, she's trapped in this human body. And so people think of her as a child. And so even though she has much experience and seen many different kinds of things, she is usually treated as someone who needs to be taken care of, to be cared of in the way that most children are. And this deeply frustrates her and makes her experience of the vampire life deeply unsatisfying, because she is not represented. She doesn't experience this as an adult in which most other vampires are. And so this kind of shows this tension, I think, is that vampires are usually thought of as self-sufficient, and that's very, very different from most human beings. So for vampires, the immortal life is something that's not desirable, not because it's boring. In fact, I think vampires show that they have very, very interesting and imaginative lives, but ultimately they have very, very lonely lives, and this loneliness overcomes them, and they seek out relationships with other immortals. But this is a very, very unsatisfying kind of community to have, because they don't really need each other in the way that human beings do. And I think that this shows something about the structure of human life that is really interesting from a philosophical standpoint to talk about. It's our interdependency and our need to care for one another and to take care of one another. Immortals don't need this. And this is why, from our standpoint as human beings, this can seem like a very undesirable kind of life to lead. This is why I think that one of the best depictions of immortal life to come around lately is not a vampire film, but it's one that's found in the new Netflix movie, The Old Guard. Now, if you haven't seen this, there's going to be some spoilers in here, so you might want to watch out. But I think that The Old Guard has one of perhaps the best philosophical takes on immortality. In this story, you have Charlize Theron in a really great action role that she's really coming to be known for, especially after her knockout performance in Atomic Blonde. She portrays Andy, or Andromache, the Scythian warrior. She's an ancient warrior, thousands of years old perhaps. She, in fact, doesn't really remember how old she might be. And she leads a band of immortal mercenaries. Now, what I like about Andy and the way that she embodies the immortal life is that she demonstrates why Williams is wrong about the tedium of immortal life. She's someone that's able to experience rich, repeatable pleasures. There's a really important scene early on in which she's depicted as really savoring a piece of baklava. And she has experienced this food time and time again for thousands of years. And in fact, she's such a connoisseur that she can tell you where the baklava is from just the tastes of the different ingredients and how it's put together. She's obviously not gotten bored by eating baklava for thousands of years. Through the course of the film, she is seen as being able to appreciate these kinds of repeatable pleasures. But as her character arc develops, she also realizes her categorical desire, the thing that gives her life meaning. She recognizes that she has to be a righteous warrior to fight for the right cause. The world always needs heroes, and she and the other immortals are uniquely placed to be able to offer care to human beings and to give them the kind of attention and to save them in situations that they need in order to be able to lead good lives. This is what the immortals in the Old Guard are able to do. This struggle to be able to be this righteous warrior is something that's ongoing. It's never complete, but Andy realizes that it gives her life purpose, and it's not something that she grows tired of, because she realizes that the struggle of good and evil is something that's ongoing, and it manifests itself in different kinds of ways in different sort of settings, and she will always be there with her band of immortals, hopefully to try to deal with it. So she's able to have repeatable pleasures, and she's able to have categorical desires that don't ultimately bore her. Now, what I see in the Old Guard is that what makes immortal life undesirable is not boredom, but in fact, the loneliness. And I think that in the film, you see this represented in the character arc of the character Booker. At the end, I won't give away too much of this, but one of the younger immortals in Andy's group betrays the group, and he's exiled from the group of immortal heroes by them at the end. This exile from the family or the band of immortals is thought to be the worst punishment that the group can come up with for the crime of betrayal that Booker commits. Wandering alone for 100 years, not being able to have any kind of meaningful relationships with the immortals is going to seem like hell to him. He, during the film, discusses how he is unable to have meaningful relationships with mortals because he outlives them. So it's a very sort of MacLeod Highlander kind of story. And so he, at the end, is punished by the immortals by being cut off from them. I think this shows that for immortality, what makes it undesirable is not living a life that's boring, because it's not boring. What makes it undesirable is if you don't have the ability to be with people who understand who you are and can care for you and love with you. Immortals can't do this with humans because they are like gods. And so immortal life is undesirable because it can become lonely in a very, very profound way. I think there's another character in here that's really important to sort of show the undesirability of life for a very, very different reason. There's a character named Quinn here, and she was a very early compatriot of Andy thousands of years ago. Her immortal life is undesirable and in fact horrendous, because something happened to her that has driven her insane and perhaps evil. Right at the end of the movie, there is the suggestion that there's going to be a sequel having to do with the return of Quinn. But early on in the movie, it's clear that Andy and Quinn had a really important bond and relationship of love together, but they were burned as witches. Where Andy was to be burned as a witch, and Quinn was actually put into a torture chamber from which she could not physically escape, and then she was dropped to the bottom of the sea. So she experiences hundreds of years of continual death. She dies and then is resurrected and then is immediately drowned and goes through it again and again and again for hundreds of years. Yikes, this is a really, really horrendous immortal life. But again, it doesn't have to do because it's boring. In fact, it's just that she has to experience death in a really horrible way many, many, many times. But I think that the Old Guard, again, emphasizes this point that what makes an immortal life undesirable is not necessarily because it's going to get boring at any point, but that it will become possibly very lonely. And this is something that the immortals in this film try to avoid as much as possible. So what can we say in the end about the way that Star Trek Picard handles immortality? I think in the end, what we have to conclude is that Data got duped. He ends his consciousness on the basis of thinking that since human beings die, death must be not just one thing among other things that human beings undergo, but it's the single thing that gives human life foundation and thus its meaning. And this seems just wrong to me because it fails to realize that we have the capacity to give our lives meaning in a whole variety of different kinds of ways because of the enormous capacity of our imagination and how we come to understand ourselves and the place of our aims and goals in community with one another's. Data gets convinced that it's death that gives us this meaning. I would argue that it's our imagination that gives our life meaning. And in fact, how we conceive of death and longevity in the overall structure of our lives is what's important. Not death itself, but how we conceive of death. And that's an imaginative kind of task. Anyways, love to hear what you think about the immortal life and the question about whether or not it's undesirable because it's boring, or whether you agree that it's lonely, or whether or not you think that there's another reason to think that immortality would not be something desirable for human beings. Let us know what you think. Drop us a comment down below or send us a message. You can check out some of our other videos on the session, but you can also reach us at Anarres Project on social media. You can also listen to our podcasts at SoundCloud. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everyone. Let us know what you think and live long and prosper.